So I want to talk to you guys about the clever new anti-Bernie Sanders trick that the media and corporate Democrats are doing. Now, this trick works, so it's a little scary, to be honest with you. Most of the time, I see how they angle against Bernie Sanders, and it's just useless, and it's almost comical. And it makes you laugh. And you go, really? You think you're going to get him on this? Like the most recent one was Politico, where they spoke to former Hillary Clinton advisors, and they were trying to hypocrisy burn Bernie because they said, oh, he flew on private jets around the country. Yeah, he flew on private jets around the country because it was on short notice and because he was campaigning for Hillary Clinton to beat Donald Trump because you asked him to and because he wanted to defeat Donald Trump. He did like 39 rallies for Bernie. And then how does Hillary's team repay him? They try to shiv him when he announces a run again. And their whole argument is, he was on a plane. So, and the argument, by the way, is he's also against climate change, but he was on a private plane. Got him. Stop with this nonsense, man. Listen, there's some issues that are top-down issues that have to be addressed by the government, and you cannot address them on the individual level. It's like saying, imagine somebody said in, the 1940s, okay, we're going to take on the Nazis. Oh, yeah? Why don't you take your rifle and go fight them by yourself? Because that's the dumbest fucking thing I've ever heard, and we obviously need a mass mobilization to fight them? Maybe. Same thing with climate change. Oh, yeah? Why don't you stop with your carbon emissions? Because obviously we need a mass mobilization, and obviously this is not something that can be achieved at the individual level, especially since it's 100 corporations that are responsible for 71% of the emissions. So you can't, even if everybody stopped all their personal carbon emissions, it's not going to put a fucking dent into it. But shit like that does not land. People read it and they're like, shut the fuck up. Allow me to give you a one-way ticket to shut the fuck upsville, bitch. Not interested in your nonsense. So, but here's an issue where, listen, it's sticking a little bit. And it's kind of scary to see because it's such nonsense. So, what am I talking about? Well, a few weeks ago, an article came out that basically said, like, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and I think even Elizabeth Warren they put in the article, but I might be wrong about that. The new issue that the Democrats are hopping on board with, reparations. And they have this phoning article. Now, the reality of the situation is this. They are calling it, or at least some of those candidates are calling it, oh, I support reparations. When you read the specifics of it, it's not reparations at all. They're talking about, like, Cory Booker's baby bonds. That's not reparations. I think there's targeted tax credits. That's not reparations. And in some instances, it's not even for the black community specifically, but they're calling it reparations. So what we have here is dishonest politicians, a dishonest media that plays along with them, and frames this issue as, oh, would you look at that? Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, they're out-lefting Bernie Sanders. Isn't that great? Don't you want anybody but Bernie? And again, they're framing it as, see, red meat to the base. We have, a further left-wing position here that Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren are taking beyond Bernie. Now, what's happened since that totally misleading article came out and, the total misdirection on this issue happened, Bernie Sanders was asked about reparations on his CNN town hall with Wolf Blitzer. He was asked about it in maybe every single interview he's done since he's launched. He's too honest to say he supports direct reparations when he doesn't support reparations. Again, the other candidates are not honest, so they're like, yeah, I support reparations. And you read their plan and it's not reparations. And so, boom. What's the trick? The trick here is, oh, shit. They perceive his weakness as he doesn't do well among black Americans. So let's try to kneecap him further, and let's try to undermine him, undercut his argument as the furthest left option, and the candidate of the people, and let's try to prop up people who are more corporate as being for the people and being for the black community. And then they're trying to feed this narrative of like Bernie Sanders, old, out-of-touch white man, Bernie Sanders, not as good on these issues as Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and maybe even Elizabeth Warren. And it is as cynical and destructive and misleading and bullshit a smear tactic as I've ever seen. But God damn it, it's clever and it's working a little bit. Now, in order to discuss this further, we have to get into the issue of reparations. Is reparations something the Democratic candidate should support? And is reparations something the Democratic candidate should put front and center? You want to know what it polls at? 32% popularity. Now, by the same token, take the issue of abolishing the death penalty. Even though I'm personally in favor of abolishing the death penalty because 4% of the time we kill the wrong people, okay? Would I be telling a Democrat in the 2020 race to run with and put that front and center? Yes, I, as a candidate, am running on abolishing the death penalty. No, I wouldn't tell them to do that. Why? Because the death penalty is actually popular in this country. I haven't seen polls recently, but the last time I saw them, it was about 53%, 54% of the country that supports the death penalty. So this is called not being a dumbass and winning elections. This is called using your advantages. This is called crafting a campaign that gets widespread support and propels you to victory. And then, in the case of the death penalty, if you get elected and then you have the opportunity to do something to stop the death penalty, even though you didn't run on it, yeah, fight to change public opinion on that issue, and then do the right thing and get rid of the death penalty. But on the issues of reparations specifically, it only has 32% popularity. So in some ways, it's like a weird race to the bottom type thing where Kamala Harris and Cory Booker and even Elizabeth Warren are like, okay, we are going to try to do what they think is appealing to the Democratic base, and we're going to call this thing we're doing reparations. It's not reparations. By the way, the policies that they're actually fighting for, or they say they support, baby bonds and targeted tax credits, I think those are more popular than reparations. So if they were just honest and said, no, I don't support reparations, but I do support baby bonds and tax credits, that would be more popular and would probably get them more votes. But again, they're weaponizing this against Bernie Sanders specifically because they don't want the African-American communities to support Bernie Sanders. Now, in the polls, Bernie Sanders is doing phenomenally well with people of color. In fact, he has more support among people of color than he does among white people. And that flies directly in the narrative that you've heard. Now, the narrative that you heard is not complete and utter bullshit. It's just a little bit bullshit. So what I mean by that is this argument of Bernie doesn't do well among people of color or doesn't do well in the black community, that is based on 2016 vote totals. So in other words, it was specifically in southern states with heavily black Democratic populations where Bernie Sanders struggled in 2016. So that's where that argument comes from. Now, again, today, his favorability rating with people of color and the black community is through the roof. So my guess is the only reason he didn't do as well back then is name recognition. Is that at the beginning of his campaign, not many people knew him except the deepest of political junkies. And he was also running against a behemoth who was Secretary of State and former First Lady, and was also the candidate who was considered, it was either Obama or Hillary in 2008. And the black community voted for Barack Obama, and then, again, fast forward, 2016, they had the option now of voting for the person that they was maybe their second choice in 2008. So they're like, okay, we'll go for her. So she had a giant name recognition advantage. And so Bernie Sanders is fighting very hard to take what was his one electoral weakness and win. And what's happening is they came up with this cynical, clever, crafty argument to try to undermine what he's doing in order to gain more support in the black community. Because Bernie Sanders, in terms of the actual votes, Bernie Sanders kills it in all of the Rust Belt states, the swing states, and the area where you can argue a Democratic candidate needs to be most strong for a general election. So since Bernie's already, game, set, match in those places, he's beloved in those places, the one area where he needs to to get a little better. Actually, you could say New York, you could say California, and you can say in the South. So he's working his ass off to gain more support, gain more votes, fight for a platform that helps all Americans, including the black community, and they're trying to undercut him and undermine him by using this issue of reparations cynically. Now, the final point I want to make is this. I actually think it's super condescending to the black community, the way that this issue's framed and the way that it's discussed. Because most politicians, when you bring up black issues that affect the black community, it's almost like they think that black people are incapable of thinking of issues outside of if you put the word black in the sentence. And I don't think that's true at all. I think making the minimum wage a living wage is a black issue. I think being pro-union is a black issue. I think being for Medicare for all is a black issue. Healthcare is a massively important black issue. I think issues of war and peace, that's a black issue. I think basically all issues are black issues. Now, are there some instances where specific issues impact the black community more? Sure. Criminal justice reform, for example. It is true that the war on drugs is implemented in a bigoted way. It just is. You could have black people and white people sell drugs, use drugs at a similar rate, and black people are arrested 4 times more often. So there are real issues in terms of mandatory minimums. There are harsher sentences against black people for the same crime that, when a white person commits it. So there are real issues there. But on those super real issues impacting the black community, Bernie Sanders has the strongest platform. And I would argue that's not even just an opinion, that's an empirical fact. He just has the strongest policy platform to help black Americans, but honestly, all Americans. All Americans. So it's a little frustrating how you have these politicians who pander and who are massively condescending and who are misleading and cynical in how they frame this issue of reparations. And the dominant media narrative becomes, oh my God, aren't Kamala and Cory so forward-thinking on this issue, and isn't Bernie an old out-of-touch white man? That's the whole movement. That's the whole point of this entire conversation. And, when Bernie's asked about reparations, his response is basically, well, what do we mean by reparations? So he's more honest, and he's trying to get to what exactly is your definition, and what exactly am I being asked to support here? And I want to hear the details, and then I'll let you know if I support it. Whereas the other politicians are just standard politicians, and they're perfectly willing to be like, yeah, whatever, I support that, even though they don't, and even though the record shows they don't, but they don't care. They just want to say what they think you want to hear. And in the case of Bernie, they want to undermine him in the black community. Well, listen, I'll be the first to say it. I don't think it's going to work. I think that his favorability numbers in the black community already are through the roof. I think he has higher name recognition now, so he's going to get a tremendous number of votes in that community. I mean, it might be somewhat evenly split between, Bernie, Kamala, and Cory, but that might be enough for Bernie to overall take the Democratic primary. And then there's also just a logistical question, too. First of all, what is meant by reparations? And then second of all, how exactly would it be implemented? And then you also open up a Pandora's box if you come out in support of reparations. In no other area of the law do you have this notion of collective guilt and collective punishment and collective, I don't know what the proper word for it is, but collective grace. So, and then also what happens in situations where, let's say, one of the descendants was a slave and the other side of the family wasn't slaves? Do they get like half the payment? And then what happens with instances of, say, Haitians or Jamaicans who are now live in the United States and are Americans, but they have descendants from Jamaica or Haiti, and they experience today the effects of discrimination, like, for example, in the hiring process where it's been proven there's a decent amount of discrimination. So because they didn't have slaves here going back to when there was slavery, therefore they get nothing, even though they're Black Americans, even though they're currently living the experience of Black Americans and experiencing discrimination, simply because generations prior they didn't have a family member who's a slave, they get nothing now? So there's, my point is, guys, there's a lot of there's a lot of problems with that argument, and it's not clearly defined, and we don't know what it means. And just understand, here's the point. There's a reason why it polls at 32%. Even Medicare for All, before we even started pushing it and talking about it nonstop, it was already polling at 51%. I remember because we covered it, had to be probably 2013, when very few people were talking about it. Very few people knew about it. When questions were asked about Medicare for All, 51% of Americans supported it. So there's something about that that's like inherently like, oh, that seems to make sense, cover everybody, sure. But when you talk about reparations, there's so many open questions around it in terms of how you would implement it, what exactly does it mean, what arguments are we really buying into here to say reparations are okay. There's a reason why it only polls at 32%. So, listen, the fact of the matter is, you might say Bernie's not giving a direct answer on that issue, but I got news for you. His non-direct answer is a lot more honest than the total, complete, and utter lie that's been put forth by Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and Elizabeth Warren. So just know what's going on, guys. They're trying to, and I said it, somebody tweeted the quote to me the other day. They said, I said, hear me now, quote me later, Bernie Sanders. They will go after Bernie Sanders cynically on identity politics. And that's exactly what's happening today. They're going after him cynically on the issue of identity politics, trying to portray him as an old, out-of-touch white man, when his policy platform, by and large, is the furthest left and the most for the people, and that includes all the people, including the black community. So don't fall for the bullshit. Don't fall for the nonsense. This is the correct candidate who's going to do right by everybody, and they're going to try to do everything under the sun to convince you the opposite of that, and they will undermine him in every way possible, no matter how fucked up and wrong the argument is.